Marcus Luttrell, a Navy SEAL, lies badly wounded in Afghanistan as medics desperately fight to keep him alive. While struggling to survive, he reflects on the relentless mindset that drives Navy SEALs, the determination to never quit, no matter how impossible the situation becomes, and the sacrifices they willingly make for their country. A team of 12 Navy SEALs, including Luttrell, is flying over the harsh and rocky Hindu Kush mountains in Afghanistan. As the helicopter pushes through the dark sky, the men pass the time by talking tactics, sharing stories, and joking with one another, showing the close bond between them before the mission begins. At the same time, an Afghan warlord named Ahmad Shah is moving through a village with his second-in-command, Tariq. They are searching for a local man they believe has been helping the Americans. Back at Bagram Air Base, the four main SEALs, Luttrell, Dietz, Axe, and Murphy, wake up at sunrise and begin preparing for their mission. Luttrell learns that the operation, codenamed Red Wings, is officially a go for that night. Later that afternoon, around 30 SEALs gather in the control center to go over the details of Operation Red Wings. Their objective is to locate and capture Ahmad Shah and the group of fighters with him, which they believe numbers around 10 men. The plan is for Dietz, Axe, Murphy, and Luttrell to move in first, carry out reconnaissance, and positively identify Shah, while the rest of the team remains on standby at Jalalabad Air Base overnight. Once the briefing is over, the team gears up for combat and waits for the helicopters to arrive. When they finally do, the SEALs board and prepare to launch the mission. The helicopters eventually drop Luttrell, Dietz, Axe, and Murphy onto a steep, dark mountainside. Using night vision goggles, the four men carefully begin their descent, navigating narrow and dangerous paths as the rest of the team tracks their progress from a distance. After a long and difficult trek, the four SEALs finally reach their observation point, sitting nearly 2,000 feet above the Afghan valley. But as the sun begins to rise, they realize their view of the target area is partially blocked. Wanting a better angle, they decide to move farther down the mountain in search of a clearer vantage point. Murphy attempts to radio their new location back to Jalalabad, but Dietz struggles to get a clear signal. Later that day, from their new observation point, the team finally gets a clear view of the village below, and what they see is far worse than expected. Instead of around 10 fighters, they count nearly 40 Taliban soldiers. Murphy also spots Ahmad Shah, but he's too far away to take the shot, and Dietz still can't get the radio working. Realizing they may be walking into something much bigger than planned, the SEALs begin preparing for the worst. They build hiding spots and do their best to stay concealed from anyone below. Even with the danger hanging over them, they still joke around and tell stories to keep the mood light. As the night drags on, the men eventually fall asleep, with Dietz staying awake on watch. But the quiet doesn't last. The sound of bells suddenly breaks the silence, and Dietz immediately alerts the others. The team snaps into high alert as a herd of goats wanders into the area. Right behind them are 3 local villagers, a young boy, a teenager, and an elderly man. When the villagers get too close, the SEALs suddenly reveal themselves and cautiously take control of the situation. Murphy pulls out a translation device and tries to communicate with them, but after several attempts, it still doesn't work. Christensen finally answers the radio, but just as the team is about to pass along critical information, the signal cuts out again. With the connection gone, the SEALs are left with no support, no updates, and no way to communicate with their command center. At that moment, the young Afghan boy suddenly tries to run, but the SEALs quickly catch him. Murphy lays out 3 possible options: tie the captives up and leave them behind, let them go, or kill them. The team argues intensely, knowing that every choice could lead to disaster. In the end, Murphy makes the hardest decision of all: he chooses to let them go. With no time to waste, the 4 SEALs begin climbing higher up the mountain, hoping to find a spot where they can finally get a signal and call for extraction. The SEALs continue moving uphill with their heavy gear, already exhausted from the climb. Then things get even worse when Axe slips and badly twists his ankle, making the brutal hike even harder. Meanwhile, the Afghan boy reaches a nearby village and quickly alerts the Taliban fighters to the Americans' location. The seals finally reach the top of a hill, only to realize it's a false summit, and their radio still won't work. Murphy uses his binoculars to scan the village below. Everything looks calm, almost too calm. He decides they should hold their position until sunset, with Axe standing watch. But only about 30 minutes later, Axe spots movement in the distance. The team quickly realizes the truth: they are being surrounded. The seals load their weapons and take defensive positions, preparing for the attack they know is coming. The firefight begins when Luttrell takes the first shot and drops his target. But the situation spirals out of control almost immediately. Dietz and Murphy keep trying to use the radio and satellite phone to call for help. The four men huddle behind a boulder and try to move to the right for cover, but the Taliban keep pouring fire onto them. Luttrell, Dietz, and Axe are all hit, and then Murphy is shot in the stomach. The attack becomes relentless. RPGs start flying toward their position, and the SEALs realize they have no choice but to fall back. In a desperate move, they throw themselves off a 50-foot cliff. Their bodies slam into rocks and trees on the way down, but somehow all four men survive the fall. The Taliban begin slowly descending after them, closing the distance and taking better firing positions. As they keep advancing, Murphy and Dietz are hit again. Murphy orders the team to move left, and Axe and Luttrell start to follow, but Dietz is badly wounded and struggling to move. Murphy, despite his own injuries, somehow manages to drag him forward and keep the team moving. The SEALs keep pushing through the rough terrain, desperately trying to escape, but after a brutal run through the mountains, they collapse from exhaustion. Murphy tries once again to get through on the satellite phone, but still gets nothing. Later that day, while the men are resting, they hear horses approaching. A second later, the Taliban open fire again. Murphy quickly realizes they have only one option left: to jump once more. The surviving SEALs are forced to make impossible decisions. Luttrell, Axe, and Murphy argue over what to do about Dietz, who has been left behind and is surrounded by Taliban fighters. Luttrell is convinced Dietz is already dead, but the team still decides they have to try to reach him if they can. They move again, trying to find flatter ground and some kind of cover, but the Taliban are still closing in. Murphy and Luttrell attempt to climb a steep hillside while Axe stays behind to provide covering fire. But the odds are overwhelming, and Murphy knows someone has to make one last attempt to call for help. So he makes a choice that will save the mission. Bullets tear into him as he fights his way up the hill, but he keeps going. Somehow, against all odds, he manages to make the call. Even after that, Murphy keeps fighting, firing back at the Taliban until his body finally gives out. His sacrifice saves Luttrell and secures the air support they desperately need. Hiding behind rocks, Luttrell and Axe talk about Murphy, about the call for help, and about whether rescue is actually coming. Then, later that afternoon, one of the helicopter pilots makes a bold decision. Even without Apache escort support, he agrees to put the rescue team on the ground anyway. As the rescue helicopter moves in to drop off the SEAL team, including Christensen and Patton, the Taliban fire an RPG straight at it. The helicopter explodes in midair, killing everyone on board. The second helicopter pilot, seeing what just happened, refuses to land, leaving Axe and Luttrell completely alone against the enemy. As the firefight continues, Luttrell watches in horror as Axe is hit twice in the throat. At nearly the same moment, an RPG explodes nearby and blasts Luttrell off the mountainside. He tumbles down the slope and smashes his head against a rock, leaving him barely conscious and close to death. The SEAL team on the remaining helicopter wants to help, but the pilot refuses to open the ramp or put them down in the middle of the ambush. Somehow, despite being wounded, exhausted, and surrounded by Taliban fighters, Luttrell keeps crawling down the mountain. The next morning, he wakes up alone, badly injured, and barely able to move. In a painful moment of survival, he resets his own broken shin before looking out toward the nearby village from behind the rocks. Even though he can still see Taliban fighters in the area, he forces himself to keep moving and follows a trail leading away from the village. Weak, dehydrated, and desperate for water, Luttrell stumbles through the forest until he finally finds a small freshwater pool. For a moment, it feels like a miracle. But then he realizes he's not alone. 3 Afghan men and a young boy are watching him. Thinking they might be Taliban, Luttrell reaches for a grenade, ready to die fighting if he has to. The men take him to a small mountain village led by a man named Gulab. Barely able to speak, Luttrell writes a note and entrusts it to Gulab's father, asking him to deliver it to the American forces and let them know where he is. But danger follows him there too. Tariq, the Taliban commander, arrives in the village with armed men, convinced Luttrell is being hidden there. Luttrell is questioned and threatened with death, but the villagers courageously stand up for him and refuse to hand him over. Furious, Tariq vows to return and wipe out the entire village. American reinforcements have arrived. The Taliban panic as the rescue helicopters close in, and in the chaos, Luttrell and Gulab finally get their chance to fight back. At last, Luttrell is pulled aboard one of the helicopters and finally rescued. What makes this story even more powerful is that it's not just about war, it's about loyalty, sacrifice, and the will to survive when everything is already lost. Even after losing his entire team and being hunted through the mountains, Marcus Luttrell kept fighting to stay alive. But in the end, this wasn't just a story about one soldier surviving. It was also about the men who gave everything for each other, and the villagers who risked their own lives to protect someone they didn't even know.